Hello everyone, and welcome to my first Wheel of Time video in a while, which I need to apologize for. I declared this the year of Wheel of Time and promised weekly Wheel of Time videos, and over the last couple weeks that has fallen apart. Basically, I've been working on a massive Wheel of Time project that has taken drastically more time and thought than I originally suspected. It is coming down the road, but until then, I wanted to use this video to address one of the most controversial aspects of the Wheel of Time, and that would be Robert Jordan's prose. They are hotly contested, even among die-hard fans, of whether or not he's so descriptive to the point where it's crippling the series, or no, it just adds character and beauty. There's also a lot of discussion about how he chooses to write various forms of action, as well as just his tone throughout the series. Robert Jordan's accused of everything from writing some of the most eloquent passages fantasy has ever seen to being nothing better than a watered-down YA author. So I'd like to give my opinions on the matter. Spoiler warning, mostly they're positive, because I am a giant Wheel of Time fan, and I find Robert Jordan's writing to be very beautiful, but I also do acknowledge a lot of its shortcomings and faults. And let's go ahead and just dive into that here. And today's video is brought to you by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community. Basically, do you feel like you need to know more skills sometimes? Maybe you're like, hey, I haven't done much productive and my brain feels stupid. Skillshare is the cure for that problem. Sign up for less than $10 a month. That's right, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Essentially, the price of a streaming service, except instead of just watching that dumb garbage TV, you can learn things that are useful. You can start a whole new career. Wanting to get into filmmaking? Well, guess what? Matty Brown has you covered with his course called Low Budget Filmmaking. Tips and tricks for an indie look. You can have that indie look going on, get Paul Rudd in your movie, and boom, you're in Hollywood. Full disclosure, don't know if that'll happen for you, but it could. But it's not all intensive, oh, start a new career things. They have everything from just getting into hobbies to fun, interesting courses that could just satisfy that childhood dream. So if you're interested in Skillshare and you want to support someone who helps support me here on the channel, go ahead and use that link in the description down below for a 2-month free trial if you're one of the first 1,000 people to click it. Right down there. Go ahead and click that. Right there. And I will be reading passages from the Wheel of Time, but they will be literally from the very beginning of the series. I'm talking prologue and chapter 1 of book 1. So I do believe it's safe to say this is spoiler free, unless you consider kind of starting the Wheel of Time a little bit in this video to be a spoiler, which I would disagree with. But before we get into any passages, I want to address the elephant in the room, and one of the most continually debated pieces of the Wheel of Time period, and that is Robert Jordan's very descriptive writing. You will either see people saying it's obnoxious to the point where they need to put down the books and can't finish, or it inhibited them to the point where they read the series much slower because they just dreaded his repetition. On the other side of that, there's people who love it. They really enjoy that Robert Jordan is willing to go in the detail of the curtains and dresses and buttons within a room or on a character. My thoughts on the matter are that Robert Jordan, yes, is guilty of detailed writing. It's not as bad as some people claim it is, which is of course the truth of anything debated online, right? Like, people are going to claim everything's 10 times worse than it is. But people who deny Robert Jordan is redundant and overly descriptive are insane. The man is. He likes going just with a magnifying glass through his scene at times and painting a picture as detailed as possible for you. He really does not leave out much at times, and you could claim the Wheel of Time could be a third shorter without all of Robert Jordan's attention to detail, but I would say you'd lose a lot of the character that makes the Wheel of Time what the Wheel of Time is. And if I had to assign a purpose to what Robert Jordan is trying to accomplish here with this insanely detailed writing, I think it is largely focused towards the culture building he became obsessed with while writing the series. Robert Jordan loves to build culture. It's one of the things that Wheel of Time is most known for again. Whether it's the Aiel, the Karayenin, the Shan-Chan, there's often just enough time painted to give you as deep an impression you would have had if you were standing in front of them. So I can't tell you that you're going to enjoy it. right? But if you're willing to attempt to try and reframe his attention to detail as something that is purposely trying to craft culture, whether it's the architecture of a room, the art style, dresses, what have you, you might be able to enjoy it a bit more than you would otherwise. Now, when it comes to the redundancy of the Wheel of Time, you will have magic systems explained to you again and again. You will have certain characteristics explained to you again and again. That's harder to defend now that the series is completely out there. The only defense I can mount for this is back when the series was coming out and it's this long of a series and there were decent breaks between book releases, people forgot things, and not everyone is as diehard a fan as we, the mega fans who binge the books, are. And so I think the repetition isn't as bad if you're someone who's basically reading The Wheel of Time as it was released, right? Because you may forget these things that Robert Jordan is deciding to dedicate page time to go over again. And I also will say, as the series progresses on, he becomes much more concise in rehashing or re-explaining certain things you may have received before in information. Now, what I'm about to say next may be taken as a positive by some and a negative by a few. Robert Jordan also likes to slip in information during his redundancies at times. If you pay really close attention, maybe you can catch a certain character in a lie or an exaggeration, things along those lines. So yes, these redundant passages can be tedious, but if you are obsessed with trying to glean as much information as possible from in between the lines, you can often pick up small little character traits. If, let's say, someone is explaining a system you've been explained before to another character, and then you see how that character views this thing personally, there's really never a wasted opportunity there. Yes, it's the same information again, but I often find most of the time, if you're getting redundant information in the Wheel of Time, it's at least presented through a different lens. Having Moraine explain how to channel to someone is a vastly different explanation you will receive than Nynaeve or Rand, for obvious reasons. But that's kind of a different explanation, but you get my point. There is effort put to, well, it is the same information which will annoy people. At least what you're getting is a character moment or a character standpoint that I find enjoyable. But if you're not that kind of reader who's constantly trying to dig as deep as possible into passages from a book and you're listening more casually, I totally understand and could even back the idea that yes, Robert Jordan's devotion to redundancy and detailed information can certainly come across tedious, and it would be a completely ridiculous idea for even the most diehard Wheel of Time fans to ignore this issue. No, it's there. It's prevalent in the Wheel of Time, and I don't think it's wasted page space for the reasons I mentioned, but it's for a certain kind of reader to enjoy. I can't deny that. Now, once again, before we get into specific passages, I want to address one other highly stylized approach Robert Jordan has to his writing. Robert Jordan decided that when there is a duel going on with swords in his material, he isn't going to do line after line of saying they swung down from above and then pivoted and stabbed from the low. Instead, he names sword forms to describe what the character is doing. And he will say something like, "Boar rushes down the mountain." And that should put an image of your head of what the sword master is accomplishing. I will admit that when I first started reading Wheel of Time, this was an aspect of the series that I didn't necessarily hate, but I found jarring, right? Like, it's a jarring experience to have suddenly an author go, "The hummingbird kisses the lily," and you're like, we were in a fight, what just happened? But I have not met many people who have gotten to the end of the Wheel of Time who have not begun to appreciate the artistic merit of Robert Jordan's word choice when describing these action sequences, because these sword forms he names do become very naturally woven into the narrative, in my opinion. They start to feel right, they start to fit, and you can identify certain ones that you've seen before. And so if you hear that this character for the 6th time is using this one sword form, you begin to realize, oh, that's a preferred sword strike for him. And to me, that begins to create an impression of various swordsmen throughout the series' style of combat. We have people who seem to be very aggressive just from the sword form names they're continually using, while others have these more delicate and reserved sword forms constantly being utilized for them. Or you could even see a character approaching a different fight with a different mentality than they typically have, letting you know kind of subliminally this is an opponent they maybe fear or have reverence for. Those kind of consequences are a direct result of a very artistic choice. So those are the pros, right? And I don't think the cons are actually super heavy here because there is still a lot of writing of action in the Wheel of Time that is thrusts and jabs and swinging from above, especially when swords are not involved. So I think there is kind of both sides of the coin here, where you can enjoy action from the, okay, Matt Cawthon's doing some action stuff that's just amazing. But if you like this stylized approach of naming sword forms in this sense, I think you can begin to appreciate it, especially if you're paying close attention as the series progresses. I remember the first time I was rereading the series, that's one of the things that highly stuck out to me, is suddenly I realized each individual fighter has certain sword forms they use more, and that began to kind of create an image of how various characters fight more clearly than I think I ever would have had if I was just reading their thrusts and hacks and slashes again and again and again. Because again, those sword form names are gonna make a hell of an impression on you. They just are. So those are just the two most blanket points, right, that I didn't feel the need to pull specific passages for because they're used so variously. The overly detailed, the repetition, couldn't just pull up 5 passages from the series and show how he's repeating information. That would be boring. And the sword forms are so diverse and so used in different ways that I didn't feel like I could do it justice just by pulling 2 or 3 usages of the sword forms. So those are just my full thoughts on there. Now let's pull from his actual phrasing at the very beginning of the series. And I'm literally going to read from the prologue and chapter 1. So again, I don't feel the need to go into highly detailed spoilers here. I just want to make certain that if you haven't read Wheel of Time, you'll have context for the kind of writing I'm talking about. Behind him, the air rippled, shimmered, solidified into a man who looked around, his mouth twisting briefly with distaste. Not so tall as Lews Therin, he was clothed in all black, save for the snow-white lace at his throat and the silverwork on the turned-down tops of his thigh-high boots. He stepped carefully, handling his cloak fastidiously to avoid brushing the dead. The floor trembled with aftershocks, but his attention was fixed on the man staring into the mirror and laughing. "Lord of the morning," he said, "I have come for you." The laughter cut off, as if it had never been, and Lews Therin turned, seeming unsurprised. "Ah, a guest. Have you the voice, stranger? It will soon be time for the singing, and here all are welcome to take part. Ilyena, my love, we have a guest. Ilyena, where are you?" The black-clad man's eyes widened, darted to the body of the golden-haired woman, then back to Lews Therin. "Shaitan take you. Does the taint already have you so far in its grip?" "That name, Shai." Lews Therin shuddered and raised a hand as though to ward off something. "You mustn't say that name. It is dangerous. So you remember that much, at least. Dangerous for you, fool, not for me. What else do you remember? Remember, you light-blinded idiot? I will not let it end with you swaddled in unawareness. Remember!" For a moment, Lews Therin stared at his raised hand, fascinated by the patterns of crime. Then he wiped his hands on his even dirtier coat and turned his attention back to the other man. Who are you? What do you want?" The black-clad man drew himself up arrogantly. "Once, I was called Elan Morin Tedrone, but now, betrayer of hope." It was whispered from Lews Therin. Memory stirred, but he turned his head, shying away from it. "So you do remember some things. Yes, betrayer of hope. So have men named me, just as they named you Dragon. But unlike you, I embrace the name. They gave me the name to revile me, but I will yet make them kneel and worship it. What will you do with your name? After this day, men will call you Kinslayer. What will you do with that?" Lews Therin frowned down the ruined hall. "Ilyena should be here to offer a guest welcome," he murmured absently, then raised his voice. "Ilyena, where are you?" The floor shook. The golden-haired woman's body shifted as if in answer to his call. His eyes did not see her. Elan Morin grimaced. "Look at you," he said scornfully. "Once you stood first among the servants. Once you wore the ring of Tamerlane and sat in the high seat. Once you summoned the 9 rods of dominion. Now look at you, a pitiful, shattered wretch. But it is not enough. You humbled me in the Hall of Servants. You defeated me at the gates of Paradisen. But I am the greater now. I will not let you die without knowing that. When you die, your last thought will be the full knowledge of your defeat. of how complete and utter it is, if I let you die at all. So that is the prologue to the first book, or at least a chunk of the prologue to the first book, The Eye of the World. So immediately you can tell Robert Jordan likes his descriptions, definitely putting in the time and detail to paint a picture and craft a tone. I also find a lot of his work with character is trying to set up power dynamics within relationships in encounters, and you see that one within this passage as well. One character is clearly insane, not able to process the dead around them, while another is mocking them, basically trying to say, you were so great and now you are nothing. Taking the time to note a dead body shifting, the woman that this character is clearly calling out for and he can't process or realize she is dead, puts a hell of an image in your mind. And so yes, Robert Jordan's word choice, and I find particularly his efforts on where to focus the reader, to me, usually have great effect. And that was a very high stakes scene. It's kind of the initiating setup to really explode out the rest of the series from there. And I find it to be quite an impactful one. And so now I want you to follow me on to chapter 1. And we're gonna jump to a little chunk within that. And we're gonna be following a protagonist who takes up a majority of the first book, Rand. And it's him and his father walking down a dirt path trying to bring a shipment from their farm into their village. Something that's not super high risk for these characters. They do have weapons out, but that's because they're more worried about wolves and things like that than anything else. They're in a remote village. They're not necessarily expecting to be attacked by a person. So let's go ahead and pick up on this dusty road on a windy day. As Rand watched his side of the road, the feeling grew in him that he was being watched. For a while, he tried to shrug it off. Nothing moved or made a sound among the trees, except the wind. But the feeling not only persisted, it grew stronger. The hairs on his arms stirred. His skin prickled as if it itched on the inside. He shifted his bow irritably to rub at his arms and told himself to stop letting fancies take him. There was nothing in the woods on this side of the road, and Tam would have spoken if there had been anything on the other. He glanced over his shoulder and blinked. Not more than 20 spans back down the road, a cloaked figure on horseback followed them. Horse and rider alike, black, dull, and ungleaming. It was more habit than anything else that kept him walking backward alongside the cart, even while he looked. The rider's cloak covered him to his boot tops. The cowl tugged well forward, so no part of him showed. Vaguely, Rand thought there was something odd about the horseman, but it was the shadowed opening of the hood that fascinated him. He could see only the vaguest outlines of a face, but he had the feeling he was looking right into the rider's eyes. And he could not look away. Queasiness settled in his stomach. There was only shadow to see in the hood, but he felt hatred, as sharply as if he could see a snarling face. Hatred for everything that lived. Hatred for him most of all, for him above all things. Abruptly, a stone caught his heel, and he stumbled, breaking his eyes away from the dark horseman. His bow dropped to the wood, and only an outthrust hand grabbed Bella's harness, saving him from falling flat on his back. With a startled snort, the mare stopped, twisting her head to see what had caught her. Tam frowned over Bella's back at him. "Are you all right, lad?" "A rider," Rand said breathlessly, pulling himself upright. "A stranger following us." "Where?" The older man lifted his broad-bladed spear and peered back warily. "There, down the..." Words trailed off as he turned to point. The road behind was empty. Disbelieving, he stared into the forest on both sides of the road. Bare-branched trees offered no hiding places, but there was not a glimmer of horse or horseman. He met his father's questioning gaze. "He was there, a man in a black cloak on a black horse." "I wouldn't doubt your word, lad, but where has he gone?" "I don't know, but he was there." He snatched up the fallen bow and arrow, hastily checked the fletching before re-nocking, and half drew before letting the bowstring relax. There was nothing to aim at. "He was." Tam shook his grizzled head. "If you say so, lad. Come on, then. A horse leaves hoofprints, even on this ground." He started toward the rear of the cart, his cloak whipping in the wind. "If we find them, we'll know for a fact he was there. If not, well, these are days to make a man think he's seeing things." Abruptly, Rand realized what had been odd about the horseman, aside from his being there at all. The wind that beat at Tam and him had not so much as shifted a fold on the black cloak. His mouth was suddenly dry. He must have imagined it. His father was right. This was a morning to prickle a man's imagination. But he did not believe it. Only, how did he tell his father that the man who had apparently vanished into air wore a cloak the wind did not touch? So already, at the beginning of The Eye of the World, the beginning of The Wheel of Time, I feel you can get a decent understanding of what Robert Jordan's prose are like and will continue to be throughout the series. He has a strong desire as an author to place you, the reader, in his text. A lot from that passage I just read is put there to accomplish that. The details of the writer, the feeling of the character, the itch under his skin, those are intentional decisions to make you feel as this character. Yes, it's third person limited, but often you will feel as these characters feel because Robert Jordan will take paragraphs on paragraphs to simply go through their thought processes or reactions to events that occurred in a moment. Where I feel the people who are coming in and saying Robert Jordan writes simplistically probably more focus on his dialogue, because we've talked about this again and again, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but Robert Jordan refuses to write in Lord of the Rings or classic fantasy style high prose, and he has a more direct way of speech. While there are certainly quirks and twists to the way his characters are going to speak to one another, it's not a fully different than any way any person in this planet is currently talking. You aren't going to get thou ested in The Wheel of Time. Characters are going to go, hey, how's it going? But that's a strange hybrid, right? To have an author who will use as much beautiful flowery language as possible in describing things, but when it comes to the way his characters speak to one another, it's simple and direct. I'm not saying it's not beautiful. There are many lines of dialogue within The Wheel of Time that will really spin you through a loop. Characters will give monologues, but they're not these grand, overly flowery monologues. They feel like they're coming from real people who are experiencing these drastic events. And that small hybrid fusion that results in a bit of a disconnect, I think, is where a lot of debate of Robert Jordan's prose stems from. As a reader, to not be bothered by any aspect of Robert Jordan's writing, you have to like a very descriptive, flowery backsetting to the abrupt and direct way characters address one another. Even in that prologue, which is supposed to be taking place in an age of legends, a time long past, we aren't having characters speak too flowery, and it seems like they're having a conversation with, well, many layers, still human beings talking to one another. But I don't think it's dumbed down or stupid. I would just categorize it as direct, and to me, more human. That's coming from a fan perspective, and I'm curious to see what people who do have a larger issue with Robert Jordan's prose than I'm willing to say I have, would say in the comments down below. So feel free to jump on into that comment section and give me your perspective on The Wheel of Time if you've read it a whole lot, or just based off of the passages I read here. How do you feel it strikes you? And the taking over of Brandon Sanderson later on in the series does result in a shift, but I want to say, just ending this video on the idea that not as large as you would think. Brandon did a pretty outstanding job, especially as he got further into writing The Wheel of Time, of mimicking Robert Jordan. And on top of that, he already had Robert Jordan influences all over him, so I don't think it was that hard of a leap for him to make. But I do maintain, reading Sanderson writing Wheel of Time is vastly different than reading Sanderson writing for himself, mainly because of the flowery speech he adapted while writing Watt that he did not then carry on over to his own works. So I feel like that's the largest difference between the two authors there. Robert Jordan maintains this flowery way of describing things combined with a direct style of dialogue. Brandon Sanderson's prose you can say a lot about, but no aspect of them I would even remotely qualify as complex or flowery. He's direct through and through, and I think that's the largest difference between the two, and a pretty cool evolution to see readers jump from one to the other and see how it strikes them. I kind of had to talk about Brandon in this, right, because he's the one who managed to finish off the prose of The Wheel of Time. But that is my take on the largest controversies around Robert Jordan's approach to writing The Wheel of Time, and the largest debates that people have. I find most of it to work for me, but I'm extremely understanding for those who don't, because it is a rather odd prose upon very close examination. There's layers to it that don't vibe 100%. I'm willing to admit that. I just, from a preference standpoint, because I pretty much grew up reading it, love them. But anyway, this has been my deep dive into RJ's prose here. It's a bit of an impromptu video I just wanted to crank out, and I thought would spark a very interesting discussion among the Wheel of Time, or on Twitter, hashtag Twitter of Time community. Let me know your thoughts. I'm really curious to see the people who have been reading this series for longer than I've been alive, their take on it versus those who started reading it later as it came out, like myself. Because, you know, I didn't start reading it until I was old enough to, and that was around 2005 or 6, so I was pretty late in the series there. Anyway, like and subscribe, guys, if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace!